Psychologists. What's the most interesting mental disorder you've encountered? I used to work in a children's home and I had two girls who were very similar. One would go missing from care every night, phoning 999, claiming she had done XYZ, was feeling hopeless, etc. The hospital would see nothing was wrong, send her home, and the next day she would do it again. The hospital knew her on site in the end. One time she said she thought her appendix hurt or something like that. My colleague, a trained technician with the ambulance service, asked if she had certain symptoms and she would go, "Oh yeah," and move her hand to that specific area. My colleague said, "There's nothing wrong with you." She never tried it with him again. She would also tell all the staff she was going to harm them in deadpan voice. She said it to me and I said, "Okay, can you wait till after my wedding though?" She never did it with me again because I didn't react how she wanted me to. She claimed she had been harmed by a stranger while she was missing. The police took it very seriously because she went through with a report until it became evident she literally had no idea what she was saying. The second girl was a pathological liar, delusional. She said she had 2 kids, she was too young and never had any kids, that her aunt and uncle adopted, showed pictures and the kids were spitting images of their parents, said she was engaged, said she was a professional ice skater before hurting her back and made claims of cruelty against a foster father. There was no evidence of this. Therapists basically discovered these events may have happened, but they happened to other people, not to her. She heard of these things and then applied them to herself and fully believed them. She was neglected as a child and her mother was an absolute waste of oxygen, so she did it for attention. Both the girls would also punish themselves in completion with each other and another girl who was depressed. As soon as this girl moved into a different home, it stopped. The first girl would make them more obvious and make the biggest fuss about them. Once she had me wrap cellophane around her arm to stop her from doing it. The other was more genuine and you could tell when it was because the wounds would really be small, but she would make a big deal out of it. Story 2. As a psychiatrist who's worked in highly secure settings, I've dealt with several offenders, but one of the cases that stands out to me the most is an OCD case from training. So for those unaware, OCD has various forms. This man is suffering from objectifying OCD or the thoughts are of a taboo nature. To be clear, these people have no desire for taboo relations but are plagued by constant distressing thoughts of doing so, closer to memories than thoughts. So this man had this kind of OCD and had been admitted after his daughter called the police. He'd been holed up in his room for months, refusing to come out, refusing to talk to people, and being utterly disgusted at himself. When the police came to talk to him, he assumed they knew about his condition and went with him. His daughter, an adult herself, asked to give him a hug as he left, but he refused, citing that he couldn't bear it. The review was one of the oddest I've had. It was essentially an hour-and-a-half review where he said nothing. The thoughts of what he had done were so abhorrent to him that he couldn't fundamentally bring himself to talk about them, but he desperately wanted to. So anytime I tried to end the session, he grappled with coming up with a reason for me to stay, desperate to tell me about these thoughts but unable to verbalize them as that would make them real. Instead, he continued to talk around the topic, leaving out important, sensitive words or sitting in silence until I tried to leave and begging me to stay. It seems he had been racking his mind to try and place these negative images of times in his life, believing he had blacked out and committed atrocious acts, and now these were memories resurfacing. This case taught me a lot about treating psych patients, but one of the oddest points was that he was one of 3 male patients all admitted with the same thing at the time. This is far more common than people realize. It's comforting to know that these people can get help. Story 3. Schizophrenia is by far the most interesting. Both my parents have schizophrenia, and I really notice how they react differently than usual when it's more here than usual. For example, my mother thought for months that she was going to pass away and was seeing and hearing weird things. She didn't describe what because she said it was too weird, but she really thought it was going to happen and used to hide in her room and cry because she was scared. My dad was always kind of scared of people around him when he was alive. He thought everyone was there to harm him or bring him back to prison. He was very traumatized by it, even though people seemed normal to me. At the end of his life, it got worse. He thought an old friend was going to come looking for him, even though he hadn't spoken to that friend for years. He showed me he had 2 guns in case the guy found him. He would also cry every time I saw him and seemed exhausted. I think he couldn't sleep. Usually he was struggling to sleep already. My mom is okay now. She takes medicines and they work. She seems pretty normal now, even though she's easily stressed and still doesn't trust people easily. She's really brave. She even managed to get her driver's license 2 years ago. She only drives in her own city for now, but it's already huge for me. My friend also had an uncle he had never met who ended himself because of schizophrenia. His aunt told him that he saw disturbing things a lot. He'd walk down the street and see ghosts in the aftermath of car accidents that weren't there. He tried medicine, but it made him feel worse. I find schizophrenia fascinating because the mind can trick your eyes into seeing things that aren't there. Story 4. Medical doctor here, a neurologist. My answer is Capgras delusion. The patient is convinced that a family member has been replaced by an imposter who is completely identical. For example, the patient will tell you the person sitting across from them looks exactly like their spouse, sounds exactly like their spouse, and has all the memories of their spouse. but that's not actually my spouse. And the patient oftentimes isn't overly distressed by this imposter. In 20 years, I've only seen the condition twice. This was a Capgras delusion case I had a few years ago. In this instance, it was a mother who was under the false belief that her son was a clone. We had some success with the typical antipsychotics, and I had helped her focus her energy on being a good mother to the kid, whether it was hers or not, because she could agree that the child was innocent and needed a loving home. Family support was also crucial. The other one happened about a year ago. This patient had a bout of grass-induced psychosis and became convinced that his mother and several of his close friends had been replaced. He wasn't sure if the replacements were aliens, clones, or simply actors. Basically, the idea was that people entered a form of the Matrix, some voluntary, some not, and as they entered, they were replaced so that friends and family would remain unaware. The delusions continued for about 2 weeks until he checked himself into a hospital. He immediately tried to escape, was pinned down by no fewer than 8 nurses and guards, and was injected with Haldol. It took him 36 hours before he regained consciousness, about a week on risperidone before the delusions were reduced to a reasonable level, and a month later, he actually believed what had happened was a psychotic episode, instead of something more sinister. Story 5. Derealization or depersonalization disorder. Everything is different. Everything is the same. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed. People didn't even know before that nothing, which has changed, even existed in the first place. It's like when you repeat a name 30 times and it completely changes everything while, in essence, staying the same. But not with a name, with everything around you, with yourself. That is what you call your life and everything that has happened or will happen in all of existence. At the same time, this feels like the opening of Pandora's box. You feel like you always knew this, and this is a higher truth that could potentially bring lasting peace and love, but nobody would understand, you included. Also, at the same time, you feel like you have to hold on to what you were before so as to not pass away or go insane and never be able to feel again or control anything. Some philosophers say it's the ego watching itself and while it's still fully awake, not having practiced meditation or similar things for years and not having accumulated enough love and trust to let it end slowly, which causes an ongoing fight between the glimpse of enlightenment and the fully conscious ego watching itself wither away, trying to protect itself. A possible explanation for this happening while there's an immediate threat is that the body decides to do this for the person to be able to continue in a situation you can handle with a functioning ego, like freak accidents, etc. Then it's not called a disorder because it is most often short-term. Long-term, it could be that this happens for a similar reason, the body trying to protect itself from the source of ongoing heavy stress, most often your ego and everything in relation to it, and therefore shutting it down. Story 6. Medical doctor here. Not a psychiatrist or psychologist, but I did encounter a pretty interesting patient case in my psychiatry rotation when I was in medical school. There was a patient at an inpatient psychiatric facility with negative ideation. During her admission, she constantly insisted that she had a mass and demanded to be physically examined only by male doctors. When the psychiatrist I was rotating under declined to perform a physical exam, she asked me to do it during my daily patient interview. I also declined the physical exam, but I had a bit of a hunch to check her medical records. It turned out she had an ultrasound done a week before that found only normal tissue without masses. However, apparently this lady had frequented many doctors' offices with various complaints of an unspecific nature, and would usually focus on erogenous zone complaints when she visited male physicians' offices. The psychiatrist I was working with diagnosed her with factitious disorder, formerly known as Munchausen syndrome, and also felt she had a personality disorder. He felt it was histrionic personality disorder, but also felt it was possibly borderline personality disorder. Definitely cluster B, though. It seems her goal was mostly attention from medical professionals. She had lots of issues, but we also had to be careful to make sure she wasn't fishing for a lawsuit. Patients like her are why doctors document everything meticulously, so the patient wouldn't admit to making things up all the time. According to the psychiatrist I was working with, she didn't actually believe any of her health problems existed, and her primary goal was to get attention from medical professionals. If she actually believed she was sick, we would have diagnosed her with illness anxiety disorder, commonly known as hypochondria. Alright, time for a quick break from fascinating psychological conditions. If you've been enjoying these eye-opening yet eerie trips through the human mind, click those like and subscribe buttons to show your appreciation and support. It'll keep the channel going so you can enjoy more content like this. Story 7. Mental health counselor here. The interesting one is schizophrenia with visual hallucinations. Most people with schizophrenia have auditory hallucinations. I did not realize how much more unsettling the visual one is. The client I had with this disorder used to see me and other people he knew. He called me up once, yelling at me for coming into his apartment early in the morning. Even if I told him otherwise, the experience of seeing me is very real to him. I can't imagine seeing people in my own home, especially at night. That would freak me the hell out. I also consulted a lawyer about this, who did about 10 years of criminal law. He's had many clients with schizophrenia. Auditory hallucinations must be disconcerting and terrifying. Visual hallucinations would also be awful, for the oddest one he's come across was olfactory delusions. A client who had a psychotic break and had a range of hallucinations told him to hire a car and drive across the country ASAP. She was arrested doing 180 kilometers per hour through a country town, speed limit 60 kilometers per hour on a major highway. When he came down to see her, she was obviously unwell, but she also kept sniffing his hand anytime he asked her a question. Later, when she was well again, she explained it to him. She remembered everything even though she had no history of mental illness prior to this time. Everyone bad, i.e. all the police officers, smelled bad to her at the time, but she said that she knew she could trust him because he smelled like sunshine and flowers. This stopped, along with her other hallucinations, when she came out of psychosis. He never knew before then that delusional smells were also possible. Story 8. Dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. I'm not a psychologist, but I used to be an assistant to a school social worker. We worked very closely together, so I pretty much saw everything she saw. We worked with kids who had emotional issues. Some had trauma issues. One girl came to us in the 9th grade. She lived with her grandmother and father at the time. Her mother and stepfather tormented her and went to jail when she was little. She had no recollection. Whenever she experiences confrontation, fear, stress, or conflict, she acts differently instantly. Sometimes she would crawl under her desk, hiss, and bark. Sometimes she would run around the room and giggle, skip, and squeal. Sometimes she would squint her eyes and make weird noises. When the social worker got in contact with the therapist, she informed her that it was DID. She also informed her of the various names and identities of her other personalities. Basically, the girl transforms into other people when she's scared because it helps her escape the reality, which was once too horrific to bear, of what's going on. She has no clue that she does this and often reports that she has memory issues. She's one of my favorite students to work with. I remember the first day I met her, she was sobbing and ripping up papers because she didn't want to be there. On my last day there, we were joking around and drawing pictures together. I wish nothing but the best for her. These are some really interesting stories. I should tell my friend Tyler Durden. He always seems to be here. Story 9. Hemi-neglect is a pretty interesting one. The affected person just doesn't realize that they have two halves to their body and only take care of one. Shave one side of their face, brush their hair on that side, wash themselves on that side. The other side basically becomes a mountain man. They can have environmental or personal, their own body, neglect. Usually they will have both, though. An individual with personal neglect will find a shirt and put their arm through the unaffected side and perhaps the head through the middle, but will stop at that point thinking they're done with their other arm, not participating in the activity. An individual with environmental neglect will need to have the shirt on their unaffected side of vision to even find it. They could perceive the shirt as only being half if it's in the middle of their visual field, as they wouldn't recognize the other half being present. Those people also need a lot of help to eat, as they can find things on one side of their tray despite looking and being provided with plenty of cues. As with anything, there's varying degrees of severity, and I'm describing the more severe signs and symptoms above. Pusher syndrome is also something interesting that tends to happen with neglect. Neglect, and especially pusher syndrome, make therapy and that person's recovery very difficult to work with and overcome. They will have other deficits as well, so this on top just adds that extra special layer of complexity. These stories make me realize that villains in movies aren't too fictional, if you think about it. The past one was Tyler Durden, this one's Harvey Dent. Story 10. Phantom pregnancies are pretty fascinating. A woman can be so convinced that she's pregnant that her period stops, she gets all the classic symptoms, and her belly might even grow. Nobody's totally sure how this happens. It's suspected that Queen Mary Tudor experienced multiple phantom pregnancies. In one case, she went into confinement at around 8 months and didn't leave until the 11th month mark. It was clearly obvious there was no baby. It was probably the most humiliating moment of her entire humiliating reign. Her husband abandoned her, both the court and the people thought she'd lost her mind. Bear in mind she was likely too old to conceive by the time of her marriage, and her constant illness from a very young age over stress about her mother, and a bit about her father. There was no way she would have been able to have a normal pregnancy. Also, shared psychotic disorder is pretty crazy. There was a case a few years ago where twin sisters visited each other. One was mentally ill, the other not, and the ill one went into a psychotic state and then the healthy twin suddenly, for no reason, went into the same psychotic state. After being separated at the hospital, the healthy twin snapped out of her psychosis and was fine. The other one stayed in her psychosis and ended up hurting someone, and neither of them remembered anything that happened. The fact that phantom pregnancy also happens to animals is crazy to me. Story 11. I'm a licensed psychologist now, but before I went to graduate school, I worked in an inpatient mental health hospital in adult and adolescent units. I would say the most interesting two disorders I've seen are dissociative fugue and conversion disorder. I saw both while I was there. Dissociative fugue is a condition where someone can wake up one day and believe they're a different person for a short time. My experience was with a man who woke up and drove his car from his home until it ran out of gas, which happened to be in my city. He had no identification with him and didn't remember his name, family, or any details of his life. After a short stay in the hospital and some medication, he remembered everything and had a family member pick him up and monitor him for a while, but he still had to put gas in the car, which had been towed in the hospital parking lot. Conversion disorder is characterized by the individual losing the ability to do something, e.g. walking, seeing, talking, and believing that it has a biological component. In reality, it's a response to significant trauma and is dissociative in nature. A woman in the hospital manifested the symptom of losing her ability to walk while she was in the hospital. There was no reason as to why she wasn't able to walk. She came in walking, was unable to ambulate while there, and left walking again. Story 12. I worked as a counselor in corrections. Substance-induced psychosis. It's as scary as it sounds. I saw several clients whose mental health rapidly declined due to substance use. Some developed paranoia, hallucinations, or unpredictable behavior. When substances swept through the city, the downward spiral of some of my clients was devastating. A man I had worked with for over a year went from being sober and reconnecting with his children to being certain that the feds were out to get him. His demeanor completely changed after his use, and he was impossible to understand, was incoherent and violent even while sober. He was such a sweet man prior to it. I think he had a shot at a real future. Unfortunately, he passed away. My dad and brother both broke because of it, too. I always suspected they already had those tendencies in their brains and substances sparked them. I went through my own dependence, and while I would have delusions after staying up for multiple days, I would be back to normal after a couple of weeks of sobriety. My dad and brother would still be weird for up to 6 months after being sober. Hopefully my brother maintains his sobriety. Unfortunately for my father, he reached a point where he never came back. Even after years of sobriety, he suffered from intense delusions until his passing. Story 13. I've always thought narcissistic personality disorder was fascinating. You have people whose BS is right in front of them and they'll still tell you and truly believe that they haven't done a single thing wrong. I've got a guy who now cheated on his wife and he genuinely doesn't understand when no one trusts him. Amazing. I dated a woman who wasn't diagnosed, but I suspect she had it. Gaslighting was real to the degree where I would only speak with her in writing, even in person, and she would sit there and say things she wrote weren't actually written. She eventually admitted to gaslighting, so I'm unsure if it could even be considered NPD. She would violently argue that she did say something she didn't or didn't say something she did, even in writing. We could both be there looking at what she wrote and she would deny it. I would record her verbal conversations and replay things she said. She would deny saying them even as we heard them. She would play confused in a conversation and attribute the confusion to things never said. Literally. We could review an entire conversation and never find what she was complaining about, and she would just break down, cry, and yell. Worst of all, she sent me a message in Ramadan saying, "With Ramadan approaching, if I ever wrong you, please remember you probably deserved it and may Allah forgive you for being annoying." These psychologists have seen some truly unique cases. Some of these aren't hopeless, but what about patients where successful treatment seems impossible? Check out therapists. When did you realize your patient couldn't be helped? Next. Story 1 is just heartbreaking. See you there.